up guys, my name is Josh and today we're going to be talking about the Audeze EL-8 open backs. These are my first pair of Audezes, the first pair of Audezes that I've ever owned or even heard, and these are kind of like the lower end Audezes, but I am very impressed, especially with the build quality. Now, an important thing to know is that these are actually no longer available. You can't buy these new anymore. They are out of stock. The only ones you can pick up are pretty much online on used markets like eBay, Craigslist, Headphone, stuff like that. If you want to buy this particular pair, these are mine. I did trade them for some audio gear, and I'm going to sell them to buy new audio gear. So there is an eBay listing down below if you are interested. Now, I bring that up to add to transparency. As you guys know, I'm really big on audience transparency. I want you to know what's going on behind the scenes. So I am selling these, but I'm going to try and remain as unbiased as possible. I'm going to say good things about this, and I'm going to say some bad things about this. I think in the long term, audience trust benefits me a whole lot more than selling something in the short term. That being said, like with any of my reviews, you can go ahead and skip here if you want to skip to any particular part, if you're crunched on time. All right, and with that being out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into build. So these are probably the most solid headphones that I have ever worn. Primarily made out of metal, very liberal use of metal. They've got a ton of metal everywhere. The cups are metal, the outside grill is metal, pretty thick metal actually too. The arms are metal, the headband is metal, this is spring steel. There are a few bits of plastic like here on the inside of the headband. Speaking of that, for build quality, there is one little crack and probably the only weak point on this entire headphone. I'll show you guys a close-up so that you know what I'm talking about. And on my particular pair that did crack, I don't know if that's gonna be for everybody. That is worth noting. So that is gonna be probably the weakest point of this. Everything else feels solid. All the hinges feel very robust. And regarding build quality, I really don't have any complaints. Now for comfort, these are very comfortable, although they are a little bit heavy, and these are kind of half designed for mobile use, I would say. I mean, you could totally use them on a desk, no problem. That's where I actually prefer to use them, but you could also totally use these off of a phone for mobile use. They're pretty efficient. I'll get more into that in the power section of this. But given the clamp force, the power requirements, and the cable length, you could totally walk around with these, no problem. Now back to this build for a second. They do have this layered wood, and I was a little unsure of this layered wood because Audeze is no stranger to using wood, but I haven't really seen them use this kind of stacked wood because they have, I'm assuming, glue in between each of these, and it gives it this really cool design. But I wasn't sure on how reliable it was going to be, and honestly, this is a used pair of headphones, but I see no flaws or degradation in the wood whatsoever. So good on you, Audeze. You did a good job with these. Now the cable. The cable is kind of interesting and something that I half like and I half don't like. It is a flat cable. It's medium length. It measures about 6 feet. And it does have proprietary connectors that are specific to this headphone, which makes aftermarket cables pretty difficult and pretty expensive to find. And that's part of the reason why I'm trying to get rid of these, is because I am trying to transfer my stuff over to balanced, and I can't really find a balanced cable for this. I think I found one, but it was like almost 300 bucks. I'm not doing that. This proprietary cable does terminate to a 3.5 millimeter. You could stick a 1/4 inch adapter on it, no problem, and it works just fine with most amps. Now I do like the cable, except for one kind of design, not really a flaw because it's obviously there on purpose, is that each of the connectors has kind of this golden ring around it, and I think it personally looks a little bit cheap. And I'm not sure why that gold is on there because it doesn't seem to match anything else with the headphone. I would have preferred something that it was either black or match the kind of aesthetic with the rest of the headphone. Okay, now on to the power requirements of this headphone. So these, like I said, are very efficient. They measure at 30 ohms for impedance and have a sensitivity level of 102 decibels, which means that you can power them pretty much entirely off of a phone, no problem. If you have a mobile amp, pretty much any mobile amp is going to be powerful enough to power them. I don't really think an amplifier is absolutely necessary, but it is, as usual, recommended. Putting this on an amplifier, you're pretty much only going to see benefits. You're not really going to see any drawbacks. But if you don't have one, you don't really need one for this. All right, guys, now on to the fun stuff, the sound. Now, I'm not trying to oversell this headphone, but this is honestly one of my favorite sound signatures. And if it wasn't for the proprietary cable, I'd probably keep these and sell my M1060s. And speaking of the M1060s, they actually have fairly similar frequency response graphs. They sound somewhat similar. I would say that these are a little bit more intimate, a little bit less soundstage. And there's kind of a trade-off in the highs between those two. They peak and recess at different levels, but I'm not really going to do a comparison against that. So let's go ahead and just get into the highs of the EL-8. So the highs on this are relatively recessed compared to the majority of the mid-range and the bass. Now, that isn't to say that they're not detailed. This is still a very detailed, a very fast planar magnetic headphone. And for highs, they have a little tiny bit of a peak in the 1K area, just ever so slight. Sometimes a voice will get up there and it'll just peak and you're just kind of like, okay, it's a little too much. But that's kind of in the upper mid-range. Other than that, the high ranges like the treble are very, very well controlled. They're never sibilant, they're never too bright, but they're not necessarily on par with the rest of the mid-range and the bass. This is not what I would consider to be a neutral headphone. This is definitely on the warmer side of things. But I really want to emphasize that with this headphone, you get incredible detail everywhere in the range, including the highs, even though they don't measure as high as the mid-range and the bass range. Okay, speaking of mid-range and vocals, the vocals on this are excellent. Honestly, they're better than the M1060s in my opinion, and I would say not quite to the level of like 650s. I think they're very, very good. They're very intimate, but they're not quite that extra level of intimate like you would get with the 650s, but they do have wider soundstage. And I'll get more into imaging and soundstage in a second, but the mid-range on this is honestly very, very excellent. I was very pleasantly surprised and happy with the mid-range performance, especially getting a little bit more focus, a little bit more closeness and more intimacy in those mid-ranges, especially with the vocals. So overall, great performance there. The bass. Now the bass was kind of interesting. So if you look at a frequency response graph, it doesn't really roll off a ton after 100 hertz, except it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit tricky. The delivery is a little bit strange. See, with most headphones that don't really have a lot of roll off, you get kind of this bleed of bass into other notes. And when you hear them, when you hear a song that isn't particularly bassy, you still hear this bass presence in the background. So when you put on the headphone, you're like, okay, this is a bassy headphone. Like I'm getting this warm sense. The 4XXs feel like that. You put them on, you listen to a song, even if it's not particularly bassy, you still feel like it's a warm headphone. This doesn't really feel that way. It's weird because as it goes lower and lower in frequency, all the pressure, all the presence, all the attack is still there. It just keeps on going. And it doesn't really stop, but you also don't feel like you're wearing a warm headphone. So it's almost like a mid-range focused headphone that just has this bass that never really recesses any. And I've heard bass heavy headphones that almost sound like the bass is handled separately. So we all know what that kind of separation of the bass notes from the rest of the ranges sounds like. And a lot of warmer bass heavier headphones do that, but not these. So very impressive bass response from these. I really like the way they integrated the bass with the rest of the music, and it doesn't feel intrusive, and it's still a very large and girthy in amount, but without bleeding at all. And this is a really good example of planar bass. And it doesn't feel boomy or thick, too much pressure or anything like that. It's very clean. It's very detailed, great presence, great attack, great speed with the bass, and great amount. And I really, really like the bass implementation on this headphone. Personally, I also think the bass is better than the M1060s on this. Okay, so imaging and soundstage. I would say that overall, this is a medium soundstage headphone. They don't go extremely far out, but they're not extremely intimate. Except for the vocals. The vocals, similar to the way the 650s sound, have this great ability to seem intimate while pushing the rest of the instruments and the background music to the foreground, and it's able to do that isolation very, very well. I'm very impressed with the imaging and soundstage. Imaging is pretty tight. It's not the most tight, but it's also not very loose. It's pretty accurate, good representation of everything. I felt like overall for imaging and soundstage, this is just a very accurate headphone. That's how I would describe it. Okay, so one last thing about the sound and something that I noticed when I was doing my testing with this, because this is somewhat made for mobile and advertised somewhat as a mobile headphone, I did do a little bit of walking around with this. And one thing that I found was that this is technically classified as an open back, and it totally is. You can definitely hear the sounds around you. But one thing I did notice was that air doesn't pass through the driver very easily. There is a lot of pressure in there, and this driver is actually really, really lightweight and pretty sensitive to that pressure. So when you're listening to music, if you're bobbing your head a little bit, moving around, you are gonna have this pressure difference that affects the sound quite a bit. The first way I noticed was when I was unplugging these headphones, I was leaning over to unplug them. The right ear would actually feel a lot more compressed and a lot less open sounding than the left ear did. And it was actually fairly noticeable, like really, really obvious. And so that prompted me to get up and walk around with these. And walking around, if I was walking smoothly, it wasn't a problem. But anytime I really looked around, I would get that pressure difference. Like with the M1060, and I'm just referencing that because they're about the same price range new. The M1060s never had that problem, and air was able to pass from the outside to the inside of the driver very, very easily. This is a little bit more airtight. So not a huge deal, but something that I thought I should mention. All right, guys, I think that's gonna lead us nicely into the conclusion. Simply put, are they worth the money? For the original starting price, I think it was either $699 or $799. No, not for the sound quality. For the build quality, sure. They pretty much beat out probably almost every headphone that I ever touched, including the quality of the pads, the materials, the implementation, the comfort. It's all excellent. Very, very good. For sound quality though, it sounds about on par with a warm $300 headphone. And I think at the price range that they're offered now, even though they're out of stock, on Audeze they're listed as $340. I think that's perfectly fair. Overall, I found this to have very impressive build quality, very comfortable. I felt like they were detailed and very good, warm, bassy, kind of smoother cans. And they do have somewhat recessed highs, but they're still very attainable for detail. So overall, I was very impressed. For the price at $340 and the sound quality, the build, I'm actually gonna give this like a 9.5 out of 10. It's very, very good and definitely worth the money. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I will catch you guys in the next video. If you're not already subscribed, I do new videos every single day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.